A common change was made to infant formula. It arrived on shelves without announcement and was folded into daily routines. The physical effects of this shift emerged much later. This substitution was part of a quiet series of reformulations that reached far beyond formula. The modifications weren't announced. The products looked the same. The packaging used the same reassuring language. What shifted was technical, molecular, and entirely invisible to the people who prepared bottles every day. This wasn't presented as a decision families needed to weigh. It was presented as an improvement, a refinement of science, an optimization of nutrition. And because it came through the same channels that had always supplied formula, because it was recommended by the same institutions, it blended into the rhythm of daily care without interruption. At the time, formula feeding was already a settled part of many households. It had become routine. Mothers who used it didn't see themselves as making a controversial choice. They saw themselves as following advice. And that advice came from pediatricians, hospitals, and printed materials that framed formula not as a substitute, but as a scientifically supported option. In some contexts, it was treated as the modern choice, the rational one. What most families didn't know was that the formulas they'd been using in the 1970s were not the same as the ones being sold by the mid-1980s. The fats had been changed. The specific oils used to approximate the fat content of human milk had been replaced with cheaper, more shelf-stable alternatives: palm oil, coconut oil, soy oil. These weren't selected because they mirrored breast milk more closely. They were selected because they were easier to source, easier to process, and more economical at scale. And none of this required disclosure in a way parents would notice. Ingredient lists were printed in small type on the back of cans. They weren't explained. The language was technical. Terms like oleic acid and linoleic acid that meant nothing to someone scanning a label in a grocery aisle or a hospital room. There was no line on the package that said, "We changed what your baby is digesting." This wasn't discussed openly. Even among healthcare providers, the shift was treated as a minor formulation update, not a fundamental alteration. The assumption was that if the macronutrient ratios stayed roughly the same, protein, fat, carbohydrate, then the formula was functionally equivalent. The idea that the type of fat mattered, that digestion and absorption could vary depending on molecular structure, wasn't part of the mainstream conversation yet. So families continued. They prepared bottles the same way. They fed on the same schedule. They trusted what they'd been given because they had no reason not to. And because the effects of these changes didn't show up immediately, there was no clear signal that anything had gone wrong. The real impact appeared years later, not in infancy, but in early childhood, in patterns that were harder to trace back to a single cause. Digestive issues that didn't resolve, allergies that seemed to emerge without clear environmental triggers, behavioral patterns that didn't match what parents had been told to expect. These things accumulated slowly across thousands of families in ways that made them easy to dismiss as coincidence or genetic variation. By the time researchers began studying the long-term effects of infant feeding practices, the children who had been fed these reformulated formulas were already in elementary school. The data wasn't being collected in real time. It was being pieced together retrospectively through studies that asked parents to remember what products they had used, what symptoms had appeared, and when. And even when correlations began to emerge between certain types of formula and higher rates of gastrointestinal issues, or between feeding patterns and later metabolic outcomes, the findings were published in journals most parents would never read. The information didn't travel backward into the living rooms and pediatric offices where the original decisions had been made. What replaced the earlier formulas didn't just stay on the market, it became the standard. By the 1990s, nearly every major formula brand had adopted similar fat blends. The reformulation wasn't rolled back, it was normalized. And because it had been in use for years by that point, it was harder to argue that it represented a departure from safety. The baseline had shifted. This is where the gap widened, between what companies knew about cost efficiency and what parents knew about nutrition, between what was legally permissible and what was being explained. The regulatory framework that governed infant formula in the United States required that products meet certain nutritional minimums, but it didn't require that changes be communicated to consumers in plain language. It didn't require that alternatives be preserved. It didn't require transparency about why a reformulation had occurred. So, when parents asked their pediatricians if formula was safe, the answer was yes, and it wasn't a lie. The formula met the legal standard. It provided calories. It allowed infants to grow. But safe and unchanged are not the same thing, and adequate and optimal are not the same thing either. Most people never noticed this at the time. It wasn't the kind of change that announced itself. It didn't come with symptoms you could point to in the moment. It came with a slow drift in what was considered normal, a quiet recalibration of expectations. And that recalibration didn't only affect the product, it affected how parents thought about feeding itself. Because once formula had become common enough, normalized enough, the idea that it might vary in quality or that some versions might be better than others started to feel almost irrelevant. The message from institutions was clear. Formula is formula. As long as it's FDA approved, it's fine. Trust the system. But the system wasn't designed to prioritize the thing parents cared about most. It was designed to ensure market stability, to allow competition between manufacturers, to set a floor, not a ceiling. And within that framework, the incentive was always toward cost reduction, not nutritional optimization. By the time some families began to suspect that something in the formula might be contributing to their child's chronic issues, they had no clear way to verify it. Switching brands often didn't help because the formulations were similar across companies. Pediatricians, when asked, typically recommended continuing with formula unless there was an obvious allergic reaction. The idea that a child might be sensitive to a specific fat blend, or that digestion might be compromised in ways that didn't show up as anaphylaxis, wasn't part of standard diagnostic thinking. And so the pattern continued. Families bought what was available. They followed the instructions. They assumed that if something were wrong, someone would have told them. But no one did. What's harder to trace is how this shaped the next generation's relationship with food. Children who grew up on these reformulated formulas didn't have a reference point for what their digestion might have felt like otherwise. They didn't know that bloating after eating wasn't universal, that certain textures or types of fat might sit differently depending on what their bodies had adapted to in infancy. These became baseline sensations, normal discomfort. And because the adults around them had also been taught to trust processed food systems, to defer to institutional authority about what was safe, there was no counter-narrative being offered. No one was saying, maybe this isn't how it's supposed to feel. The companies that made these formulas didn't break any laws. They didn't hide the ingredient lists. They were printed, as required, on every container. But they also didn't do anything to make those lists meaningful. They didn't explain what had changed, or why, or what the trade-offs were. They let the silence do the work. And the silence was effective. Because in the absence of clear information, people filled the gap with trust. They trusted that someone was paying attention, that someone was prioritizing their child's health over profit margins. That if a reformulation had happened, it must have been for a good reason. But reformulations don't happen because of new science that benefits infants. They happen because of new pressures that benefit manufacturers. Lower costs, longer shelf life, easier sourcing. And those pressures don't go away just because a product is being fed to someone vulnerable. This is not a story about individual failure. It's not about parents who didn't read labels carefully enough, or doctors who should have known better. It's about a system that was never designed to make those things possible in the first place. A system where the information asymmetry is structural, where the people making decisions about formulation are not the people living with the consequences. And this pattern didn't stop with infant formula. Similar shifts happened across the landscape of processed food in the same decades. Fats were swapped, preservatives were introduced, sugars were renamed. Each change was small enough to escape immediate scrutiny. Each one was folded into products that families had come to depend on, that were woven into routines too established to easily abandon. What makes this particularly difficult to confront is that the consequences are diffuse. They don't show up as a single catastrophic event. They show up as chronic issues that are hard to name. As a generation that grew up with digestive complaints that were dismissed as normal. As a baseline of discomfort that was never interrogated because it was too widespread to seem like an anomaly. And because the system that produced this outcome is still largely in place, because the incentives haven't fundamentally changed, the same dynamics continue. New formulations, new optimizations, new assurances that everything has been tested, that everything meets standards, that families can trust what they're being sold. But trust in this context has never been a two-way street. It's been a one-way transfer. Families were asked to trust, and in return, they were given products that met legal minimums and nothing more. Families were never told what changed. They were never told why. They were never given a choice that felt like a choice. And this wasn't the only change.